Well, good evening and welcome to this live stream on the 28th of October 2025. It's Martin North here from Digital Finance Analytics. Great to have everyone this evening. Thank you very much for spending some of your time with us. Really appreciate it on the Tuesday evening. Important show tonight, talking specifically about first-time buyers and all of the recent incentive changes and how that's hitting the market, the people making good decisions, bad decisions, and how to make the best possible outcomes at the moment, of course. And Veronica's going to come in just a moment and join us on that conversation. As always, let me just remind you that we're not providing specific financial or property or legal advice. It's a general conversation only. We moderate the chat, but throw your questions and comments in as we go. And if you use @WalkTheWorld, that'll make sure I see it and gets into my queue, specifically if you want to ask a question. I've also enabled Super Chat, which means you can get your question top of the list or indeed make a contribution to what we do around here. Always appreciated. We do this not for profit. We do this because we think there's a really, really important conversation to be had, particularly now when property is, of course, well, front and center of many people's thoughts at the moment. Right, let me bring Veronica straight in. Veronica, welcome. Lovely to have you back again.
Hello, good to see you. Can you hear my voice is pretty bad?
It's a little off, but never mind. Glad to see you. And we will go on for as long as we both feel we're able to go on. I think it's probably the way it is. But Veronica, welcome back. And I just want to say thank you for coming on this evening. And I always have difficulty in trying to frame you in the right mode because you've got so many fingers in so many pies relating to property. So I don't know whether you think this is right, but what I did was I just bring you full screen. I put you on as, here we are, Veronica Morgan, okay, property without the bullshit, right? Because I think that in a nutshell is what you say on your on your website, right? And actually, I think that's really what this is about, right? Because there is so much noise, there is so much stupidity out there, and recently we've seen a lot. And just to sort of give you a little bit of a flavor of what I've seen, things like, for example, this article here, they've just poured fuel on fired up market. The real estate industry is booming. Or this one here, which is another one which I saw, which was quite interesting. The home market's warm. No, do I hear hot? Support for first-time buyers is translating into incredible competition. And they included some tips for buyers, which I might get your reaction on. Things like, it's important to stay calm. Well, maybe. But then don't try to start an auction at a low figure. And if an auction doesn't pass, you want to be the first in the bidding after. So, bid hard, which I thought was a bit odd. And then here's another one. This is fascinating, from up in Queensland. Again, desperate home buyers, investors betting on property, but dropping safety clauses on the frantic race, for example. And here's another one. Desperate home buyers trying to crack into the Gold Coast, removing key conditions from their offers, like mortgage pre-approvals and that sort of thing. The intense competition means buyers are taking extreme measures to make their bids more attractive to sellers, removing finance, subject to sale, and building and pest clauses just to make their offers unconditional. And then, of course, we have the building code pause with the 5% deposit scheme starting. So what does that do? And then just to add insult to injury, we had CBA saying they could provide an extra 40K in borrowing capacity if you rent a room. So if you're thinking of purchasing an owner-occupied property, you can include one room let out, which is an amazing thing. And then just this one to finish the story here. Now they're appearing, well, maybe the RBA won't be cutting, maybe because, Bullock's now saying, it's a bit of an issue. And so maybe interest rates are not coming down as much. So look, there's so much to talk about here, but let's get your take. The first time buyer changes that came in seem to me to be having more adverse impact than positive impact for many people. And a lot of people, I think, are being a bit fooled and therefore they're trapped for the unwary. What do you think?
Yeah, well, I think we have very good evidence to show that pretty much every first home buyer incentive has a positive effect on prices. If we call prices going up positive, which I do because I'm a property owner, but if you're trying to get into the market, it's not really positive, is it? Because you're trying to buy into this rising market, and then that feeds into the FOMO, and then the FOMO results in all of this crazy behaviour that you've pulled out of those news stories. And it's nothing that I've never seen before. We've been in this property market long enough and through the different cycles and the different booms and busts, and you see this happen, and you see people make good decisions in tough times, and you see people make really bad decisions in tough times. And I think the big risk is that belief that you just got to get on the property ladder at all costs, and then it'll sort itself out later. Well, that's very, very dangerous, particularly for first home buyers.
Absolutely. And it's interesting because right in the chat now, we've got this comment here, right? I have enough saved for a house deposit, but I have very little confidence that buying a house now or in the near future is the right decision. Any tips on finding the right people or place for guidance? And that is, I think, the problem. A lot of people are trying to make sense of the senseless at the moment, right? They're trying to figure out how on earth to make sense. And I've had a number of one-to-one conversations in the last little while with people who actually have money to buy, but then they do the calculations on what would it cost in terms of repayments, month by month by month, especially if interest rates don't go down. And by the way, there are some banks who are charging a higher interest rate for the 95% schemes compared with the 80% schemes, right? Which is interesting. So it's hard. There's also a lack of supply of property in the right place at the right point. So some people are saying, well, if I'm going to buy, I'm going to have to buy further out, which means, of course, then you've got to take into account travel time, travel costs. And one of the things that I find people forget about is the toll road costs. If you're living out in Western Sydney and you need to get into the centre, it's $30 a time to get in and back, so all of those things. And then, of course, you've got the other questions because there are some properties in areas where the insurance costs are quite high as well. And this is another example where I find that people are actually trying to work out what to do, and they're pretty desperate to try and, find a tool set, which is why I came to you, because, well, you have a tool set, don't you?
Well, we do. I know that, you didn't invite me here to pitch our program, but I do have a course for first home buyers. And Megan Wells is a buyer's agent. She's based in Brisbane. I'm based in Sydney, but we have a national overview in terms of the different regulations and buying processes, if you like, in different states across the country. And we recognise that first home buyers are the most readily, the most likely to admit they don't know what they're doing, as opposed to other people who have bought before. Quite often, that authority bias, is it there's a bias anyway. I've done it once, so therefore I must know. It's like, well, it might have been luck, but anyway, and you may not have made a good decision either, for that matter. But so first home buyers need help. They need support. They often can't afford a buyer's agent, but even if they could, there are so many crap buyer's agents out there that how do you choose a good one that actually knows enough to add value to your search process and purchasing process? That's really difficult because, again, the ones that are cheap tend to be the least experienced. And I see first home buyers who are better off doing it themselves than using some of these buyer's agents. So that's why we have a course. So Megan and I put our heads together and put together a process, because it is a process. Learning to buy a property is a process. There's a lot of planning that goes into it. You've got to get that planning right so that you do ultimately buy the right property, but you also have to be able to revise that plan if necessary, and that's built into this process that we teach. We also mentor these students. So every week on a Wednesday, we have a live campfire. One of us attends. It's us. We don't delegate this to somebody who doesn't know what they're doing. We have a Facebook group that the answers come from us. Even if our VA posts them, we wrote the answers. And this is the problem, that everyone's got an opinion out there in the property space. There are very few people like Megan and I that actually genuinely care. We haven't made any money out of this, I'll have to tell you. We sell them, we sell the courses, but it's not a particularly lucrative business. And every year we think, why are we still doing this? But we do it because we really, truly believe we want to help first home buyers make better decisions. So you can come to us. The first home buyer course is what it's called, Home Buyer Academy. You can come to our podcast, listen to our podcast to start with. There is good information out there. Sadly, most of the information out there is shit, and it's designed to sell something else. Most of the information out there for first home buyers is either designed to sell house and land packages, apartments off the plan, or finance. It's really difficult to get proper, independent, unbiased information for any home, property purchaser, let alone first home buyers. So, sorry to plug our program, but sort of have to because that's where you go.
Well, yes, I was going to say there isn't a lot of better options than that. I would also, of course, highlight the fact that the averaging information that is reported in the mainstream media is very, very deceptive, right? Because averages mask, and I always remember the joke about two or three economists all sitting in a boat, right? And they're actually duck shooting, and the first one fires and the bullet goes ahead of the duck. The second one fires and goes behind the duck. And the third one said, well, on average, the duck is dead. And that's really the point, right? The point is that averages absolutely mask. And so you have to go granular. You have to do the work. And I'm really concerned about some of these articles when people are now cutting corners and not actually, for example, getting building inspection reports on the properties and relying on the agent's marketing document, which will include a very, very naive and very simple inspection report done on behalf of the vendor, which isn't really a full, inspection report, or missing out on looking at the planning regs in the immediate area. Are they going to build a high rise next door, for example, and what could that do to the value of the property and the value of the amenity area? So all of those things are important. And what I find when I chat with people is, sure, there are some first-time buyers who've done the right thing and actually made good decisions and are reasonably happy with the decision they made. And I'm not anti-property at all, but I am concerned about the number of people who actually end up digging a hole for themselves because they end up with the wrong property or the right property maybe, but at the wrong price. And you and I often talk about the dogs and the stars of property purchase. And I'm afraid that I would put home and land package predominantly in the dog basket rather than the star basket at the moment, particularly now. And yet, of course, a lot of people are being funneled into those, or they're being funneled into the high-rise sector of the market, where, of course, the quality of construction is very low, where the strata fees are rising very significantly. And again, people get trapped with a property that is actually not what they thought it was. So we can only say it so many times, but it's really important not to get bounced into making a bad decision quickly. It's better to take your time and make a good decision slowly, even if in the process you might miss out on a property that's there. There will always be more property coming on the market. And I do think that the media, particularly that related to the real estate sector, are partially to blame for creating this panic mode, which is what I see at the moment.
Yeah, look, a couple of things there. One is, the question was also, I've got a deposit saved, but I don't feel like I want to sort of, I'm paraphrasing here, partake in the market right now. I wonder if that person has actually saved a full 20% deposit or 10%, or maybe they saved 5 and therefore they're able to qualify for the 5% deposit guarantee. I don't know. But if they've actually saved a bigger than 5% deposit, then I think it's very sad for them to not act now. Because the reality is, yeah, sure, prices at some point will peak, they'll come off again, then they'll go down for a bit, then they'll go flat for a bit, then they'll go up again, and so on. And depending on where you're buying, that cycle or that pattern has a I guess a different history. Like if you look in Sydney, for example, actually I'm pulling figures out of my head here. I think it might be Australia-wide, these figures that I'm thinking of. But Domain came out with some research a couple of years back, and it showed that for every downturn, the market spent 3 times longer in an upturn. For every downturn in terms of dollars lost, the market gained 3 times that amount in its upturn phase. So what that means is that, yeah, sure, there are downturns and some people will lose money in those downturns. But if you don't sell, it doesn't matter. If you bought the right property, you ride it out. You've got to ride these things out anyway. But the market does actually spend more time in the upcycle than it does in the down cycle. Now, that's the market as a whole. It's always dangerous to make individual property decisions based on aggregate of 11 million properties, right? So, or really it's 5.5 500 odd thousand properties that get sold every year, right? So that's really the market we're talking about here, because they're the prices that go up or down, and so, you're making a decision. If you're ready to buy, I think it's foolish to hold back because you think the market's overinflated, because yes, it might be overinflated, but it also might continue on this trajectory for some time, and you will get completely left behind, and all that hard work you did to save your deposit because you're sort of arguing with the market. And so that's sad to do that. One of the hardest things we have to do as property buyers, or anybody really in life, is accept reality. And sometimes reality is tougher than you want to deal with. So yes, I agree with what Martin is saying. Take your time and do it well, but don't sit on your haunches thinking this is crazy, I'm not going to partake of this, because you will not benefit by doing that. And the market won't give a shit whether you do or don't buy. Like, you know what I mean? Like, the only person to lose out from that decision is you. And so then what you need to do, if you are buying into an overinflated or overheated market, right? A lot of the time, this is a simple fact. It is hotter than we want it to be. You have to learn what is a good asset worth fighting for, worth paying a premium for, versus what is a dog asset or a shit asset that you don't want to pay a premium for. Now, the problem is in a market that's driven by FOMO, buyers compete for everything. They lack discernment. They do crazy things like forego all their conditions, take risks on their finance, don't get building and pest inspections, etc., etc. Now, sometimes you have to let properties go because the risks of buying it under those circumstances is far too high. Other times you can mitigate those risks if you know enough about the market, you know enough about what you're looking for, and you can actually preload an inspection. If you really become a market expert, this is what we really teach in the first home buyer course. You become an expert in that market, in that price bracket for the period of time that you're looking. And then you can start to preempt, okay, if that property that's coming, the first open house is on Saturday, or it's an off market, I can see it on Thursday. It's the first time I can get through it. And I know that they're going to have offers, and I know it's going to sell within days or on the day or whatever. And you know enough about the market, you're pretty confident you are going to want to buy that property. You can do a lot of your due diligence before you even walk in the door. You can really be ahead of the game, and that includes your price research. And this is the thing about, when you make offers like that one of those newspaper articles giving you ideas on how to bid, that none of them mention actually working out what the value of the property is and working out what your walkaway price is. Now, that actually is the most important thing that needs to be done before you go to an auction. And I've written a book on that. Here, I've got it here. Look, I wrote a book when I had long hair, about auctions. And it remains the same. That literally I launched that book got launched like less than a month before COVID hit. Timing, fantastic. But the points, nothing's changed, really. I don't really need to update. I probably need to update a little tiny bit. But look, the bottom line is that remains to be the most important thing before going to auction. You've got to do a lot of other due diligence, but people go to auction without really fully understanding the market value. They hinge or they anchor the price of the agent's price guide, except in Queensland where they can't give one. So when an agent gives you a guide, they anchor it to that, and they go in thinking, oh, maybe I better get it for this or that or whatever. They don't actually stop to think, what is it really worth in the market, and what am I prepared to go to if I have to? Two really important things. So these are things that get flown out the window when there's pressure at all sense, but it really is important to keep your head, keep a good solid head on your shoulders.
And there is data, I have postcard data information looking at a whole bunch of trends and things, which is quite helpful. Remember, a lot of the information on the property portals is partial. It's quite filtered. It's quite hard to get good sold information, particularly off the portals these days, although in some states like New South Wales, you can go for the New South Wales Registry Office and online there, pull out information for a particular postcode and look at the prices of recent deals. So there is work that can be done. And I often say, Veronica, it amazes me that sometimes people seem to spend more time worrying about the price of their replacement refrigerator and doing more work online than they do when they actually think about buying that next property.
I think that's the thing, though. It's quite simple to research a fridge. It's not so simple to research property. You don't really know where to start. And I think that's why people go, oh, it's too hard. I won't do it at all. And so that's where, that's what we teach. We teach that structure and that process so that it's not as daunting because, it simply is. And there's also so much information out there, so much misinformation, so much biased information from people that are trying to sell you something, but also people that aren't trying to sell you anything, but they might even have your best interests at heart, but they know nothing about property, but they're quite happy to give you their opinion. And there's a lot of that out there in the property space. And the latest thing is using ChatGPT for property advice. Do not do it. ChatGPT does not know, right? If you think that like opinions are arseholes, everybody's got one, right? Property opinions are arseholes, everybody's got one. The internet is full of bad property advice, right? And so much of what is on in the internet about property that has fed the machines to learn what they learn in these AIs, right? So much of that has been created by interested parties that are selling stuff. Right? So that's what the machine has learned. If you go to ChatGPT to get property advice, you're going to get that garbage. I know. I keep asking it and I'm astounded by what it tells me.
Yeah. And of course, we have the hallucinations as well when they actually make facts up, facts in inverted commas, right? And you can't necessarily tease fact from fiction. So, yes, I'm very, very concerned. And again, I've had some recent one-to-one conversations where prospective first-time buyers have quoted back to me what they thought the facts were for a particular area. And now I look at my data and say, well, actually, this is what my data says. And, my data comes from a number of different sources, blah, blah, blah. And they sort of sit there with their jaw dropping. Oh, but the computer said it. That must be right. No. That's a big deception at the moment.
Oh, like I've asked ChatGPT because, I will go there and ask questions and I think, well, that might help me. Sometimes I'm looking for some sales data or whatever. And I'll always say, where did you get that from? And I've had it give me links that don't even exist, publications that don't even exist. Like they just make stuff up very convincingly. So yes, we do have to be very, very careful about that. And, there's even, I haven't actually tried any of these out, but I've heard of new sort of apps that have been created by very opportunistic developers who think, oh, great, we're going to use the language model to come up with a way to help first home buyers, and not just first home buyers, but investors as well in particular, to help them make decisions on where to buy and what type of property to buy and how to work out all the due diligence that they need. You don't need to actually do any work. You don't need to know anything. You don't need to go and get any experience or expertise. And, it's like, oh my God, like what could be worse? You've got people who don't know anything about property but keen to make a buck. You drawing all the information from an AI that's learnt from, as we just talked about, not necessarily reliable sources, but also makes up stuff. And you're paying that and you feel good because you're actually paying for research. And like it's actually alarming. And it does really worry me, particularly about our younger generations, so younger millennials and sort of older Gen Zs who are now buying property, and they don't necessarily, value experience, and they quite like going to their peers and think the peers that hold themselves up as being successful in this space. And I just think this just feels to me a bit like the mining boom. It's coming back to haunt us, like in a different way, that there's this wishfulness around getting rich with property, which is very possible if you do it well, if you do it right, but it's almost impossible if you don't do it right. You can lose way more. There's the risks. It's just so huge. And I am horrified by some of the stuff that I see, not so much on TikTok because I don't actually have TikTok anymore. I got off my phone when I realised what privacy issues. But I do see a lot of TikTok reels on Instagram, and I'm pretty horrified at what is being put out there. And the other thing too is that property advice is not regulated, but a lot of people that are giving property advice are also venturing into lanes that aren't even property. Like all this stuff about, setting up trusts, for example. It's like, whoa, 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 whoa. They don't even realize that they should not be giving advice about that. So they're just alarm bells. They haven't even worked out what their lane is. So, yeah, anyway, there's a lot of that going on. And I do worry for the younger generations. Megan and I talk about being, old enough to be your mum. He'd look after you. And, experience really matters in property because the market does work in cycles. And if you haven't been around for enough up cycles and down cycles, you don't realize, like if you're in an up cycle, you think things can never go bad, and you don't even then understand what sort of property is going to suffer more when the market does turn. And there will be some people that really are way worse off than others when the market turns. So these are things that are really valuable intel for somebody entering into the marketplace so that they can avoid being one of those people that loses out.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, again, I quite often pick up the pieces post when people have actually dug themselves into a hole and then are trying to work out how to get out of the hole again. And it's quite difficult and awkward to do that because they have been misled on the way in.
Yep.
And what I, DFA is about helping people to make better decisions. I'm not here to make profit or anything. I'm just here because I think this is really important. And I've seen so many people got caught simply because they took on trust what they were told. They didn't understand the internal agendas that were actually going behind the scenes. And there are lots of people with lots of agendas, people with property information that they actually generate to make a profit, or financial information. They make a commission when they actually sell a loan or whatever. So you need to understand individual motivations. And I do think it's really complicated. Here's another angle on it. How generally trustworthy are mortgage brokers? And will they get the best rates rather than the largest commissions? And that's a really another interesting question. When you go to a mortgage broker, what are you getting?
Yeah, and look, there's 50,000 of them or something now. There's a lot out there, right?
Higher.
So, yeah, higher. Okay, so there's a lot of them out there. So, and like anything, that you're going to get good ones, bad ones, and ugly ones. And the other problem with mortgage brokers as well is that, and look, I'm an advocate. I say use a broker, right? So, but I also recognise how difficult it is to find a good one. And a lot of people recommend them to their friends. Oh, he's this great guy, got me a great rate, blah, blah, blah. The rate is not the important thing. The advice, the listening to your requirements and understanding your long-term objectives and making sure that your structure is correct for your long-term objectives. A really good buyer's agent too, but a really good mortgage broker is somebody that will want you as a client for life, not just to snag the commission on this deal and then sort of burn you. So, I'd really be looking, if you're talking to brokers, I'd really be looking for someone who's prepared to take the time to help you get ready to buy, because if you're a first home buyer, it is going to take you a while, and you should find a good broker before you are ready technically, right? And the sort of people that will give you guidance and advice throughout that period before you're ready, that's a good sign that they're the sort of person that really has your best interest at heart. So there's one sign. Another one is to really just see the quality, or judge them by the quality of questions they ask you about what your objectives are and what your future plans are, et cetera, et cetera. Because if they don't ask you any questions, they just start basically saying, oh, okay, well, this is how we're going to get you the best deal. This is going to how we're going to get you access to all the government incentives and whatever. And they're just assuming that is what you're after. Then I would hazard that's not necessarily the best mortgage broker. You really want someone who's much more strategic than that.
Yeah. And we had Chris Bates, your other player on the podcast, right, a few weeks ago, and he was making a very similar point that not all mortgage brokers are the same, and there are some who actually really are just out to flog your product and will use the cheapest as the main lever. But there's actually a much broader range of things that a good mortgage broker should be doing, helping and coaching and guiding, and sometimes saying no rather than yes. And that, I think, is a pretty important point too. So I think that, the word of caution there, I'm supportive of what good mortgage brokers can do. and they do have certain obligations these days to try and provide a certain level of advice, etc., etc. But unfortunately, we still see many who actually are just going after the cheap deal and the quick deal and the commission. So need to sort of separate one from the other.
It's a little bit of a problem there, though, because a lot of buyers go to them asking for that. So when you've got an uneducated, ill-informed consumer base, then you're going to get a whole bunch of brokers that just give you what you ask for without actually advising you, right? And it's the same in the buyer's agent space. You get a lot of people think, okay, well, everyone's buying in Perth. I want to buy in Perth. And so they'll go to a buyer's agent, who can help me buy in Perth? And, who can get me the most off markets? And so someone puts a hand up and says, I can. Look, I bought 100 off markets. And they're not thinking, okay, well, who's actually got the best ability to advise me on whether that's even the right thing for me to be doing? As opposed to, you want one of them? Sure, I'll find you one of them. Advisor rather than order taker. So when you're looking in the property space, it's far too important to be jumping at anyone who's just happy to tell you what you want to hear. And you want someone who will be a bit contrarian and will step back and go, hang on a minute, let me ask a few questions before we go down that path, because I want to make sure that what you're about to do is the right thing for you. Like, it might be, but it may not. There's a few other considerations here. Wow, that's music to my ears when somebody speaks like that. I think, oh, hey. Now, of course, they might be actually flogging you something else that might be not very good for you. But, as consumers, we need to become a little bit more discerning about the people we take advice from. And I'll be looking for them to ask me better questions. That's sort of the main thing there. But the other thing with mortgage brokers that increasingly I'm coming across is they are venturing into the property advice lane. And as I mentioned earlier, it is unregulated. So sadly, a lot of them get asked questions by buyers because buyers don't know where else to turn. And most of them don't know anything about property. I mean, Chris Bates is one of the few exceptions. He spent a lot of time researching and learning about property, but most don't. And so the problem is when they offer you this advice, they might be being helpful, but they also could be being very misleading. And another thing too is quite often they are being offered kickbacks by developers for house and land packages for apartments. So if a broker or accountant or financial planner, anybody ever suggests to you that you should buy a specific property, then I'd be running a mile and finding another one.
And in fact, a follow-up question there, what are the main reasons and benefits for using a buyer's agent? Well, you touched on that a little bit. Would they recommend a mortgage broker as part of the service?
I'll answer the second part first. So when somebody comes to my business, we obviously want to ask, have they already got a broker? Because we think it's important they do have a broker. Now, if they don't, then we will recommend. We've got a handful that we recommend that we do think are very, very good, right? And have many years' experience with. So, yes, we would offer that. But you've got to be very careful too. Some one-stop shops will have, we've got an accountant in-house, we've got a lawyer in-house, we've got everybody in-house. You've got to be wary of that as well, right? So those one-stop shops can stitch people up, and we've seen it many, many times. So be careful about that. It's like professionals in their own lanes. They work well together, they play well together, but they don't scratch each other's backs too much, right? So that's something to be very wary of. The main benefit of using a buyer's agent, now, it's interesting. I'll tell you the standard, you call most buyer's agents, say, I'll save time, I'll save you money, and I'm going to find you off-market properties, right? Now, honestly, they are probably the lowest on the list. What you need from a buyer's agent, if you want to have a value add experience, is somebody who can guide you to buy the best possible property for your requirements, for your budget. Now, and that includes educating you as to what the possibilities are for your search, for your needs, but also whether or not your budget's appropriate. And that's at the outset, not sort of stringing you along and then having you find that out through heartbreak of not being able to find anything or missing out all the time, but through actually structured onboarding process that educates you from the absolute get-go. So you are looking in the right place for the right type of property with the right sort of budget. And the right type of property isn't just what you told them you needed, but they will guide you on that, and we'll really tease out, is what you think you need the right property for you, and will the market support that? Like, can you actually get it for your budget? At the very beginning, that is what should be happening. Sadly, it doesn't happen often enough, right? And then throughout that process of searching for property for you, they should be inspecting them. Too many of these buyer's agents, these borderless buyer's agents, are buying sight unseen with what on the strength of a WhatsApp video from the sales agent. I kid you not. I've seen so much evidence of this behavior. I'm horrified. And I speak to sales agents across the country, and the stories they tell me, they curl your hair. So you want a buyer's agent who's going to take your financial situation seriously and is going to put your needs ahead of their own short-term gain. Now, I know it's easier said than done. And it's sad, actually, that there's a lot of transactional buyers agents out there that will take your money and you really will end up no better off. You want somebody who has got at least 10 years experience. You want somebody who understands due diligence and can demonstrate what they do to check on a property before you buy it, how they price that property, how they negotiate for you, how they set the strategy for negotiating. And in fact, I've on my website, I've got a free checklist you can download. It's a list of questions and why they're important and what you should be expecting in the answers. You don't even have to give me an email address. This is so important that I give this away for free. I don't want nothing from you. So if you go into veronicamorgan.com.au in the resources section, if you want a questionnaire for buyer's agents, you'll find it in there. I want nothing from you. It's freely available. And it's so important that you quiz your buyer's agents, because when you're in the process with them, it's sort of too late, and you also want a buyer's agent who will say no to you, and they will say no to properties. And you want to ask them, how many times do you say no to a property? And tell me under what circumstances would you say no? Because there's too many of them are so transactional. They'll find something, they'll put it under your nose. They'll tell you you've got, a couple of hours to make a decision on it because otherwise they're going to give it to the next client. Like that sort of pressure, that should never come from a buyer's agent. They should be looking after you and your requirements, not trying to shop you, usually shit properties that they've got through this deal flow that they get. So look, there's some really shitty behaviour out there, and there's no benefit of using those types of buyer's agents. None.
Just to underscore what you said earlier on, there's no formal qualification for a buyer's agent, right?
So they have to get a license, right? In order to get the license, they have to do a certificate I can't remember exactly what it's called, real estate practice, I think it's called. They have to get a diploma in agency management, and because they all go through Queensland to get it shortcut, the quickest way to do it, they get their Cert 4. They only have to do one subject to the diploma. They need no experience. And those, the diploma and the Cert 4 are designed for sales agents and property managers. There's nothing in there about negotiating. There's nothing in there about client management and brief management and educating your client. There's nothing in there about dealing with agents. There's nothing in there about due diligence. There's nothing in there about managing the emotional roller coaster of working with a client for a long period of time to secure the right asset. There's nothing in there about asset selection and capital growth. And what's the difference between a good asset and a bad asset? Nothing. So that is all missing. And buyer's agents that have had no exposure to any of those concepts, they're out there woefully ill-equipped.
Absolutely. And just want to acknowledge this little comment, because I think you'll find it quite interesting. Thank you very much, Veronica and Martin. Glad I found you both. My confidence has grown since the start of this chat. Well, that's good.
Great.
That's good. So, we're not here to white ant property, but we are saying there are things you need to think about. There are processes you need to understand. And if you can get those processes right, then there's still opportunity available. And I always say, Veronica, that if you're buying for own occupation rather than for investment, because I think the investment decision is rather different at the moment. If you're buying for own occupation, it's more about, is this somewhere where I want to live? Is this where I want to put down roots for a longish period of time? And it actually doesn't matter if prices do slide a little bit. They might. New Zealand prices have dropped significantly. But the point is, it's about finding somewhere to put roots down, and therefore buying the right property for that, rather than actually putting it just purely on the lens of, am I going to make money on that property, is actually a very, very important difference. And sometimes when I chat with people, I realize that the sort of the make money decision and the where do I want to live and put roots down decision, they get all scrambled.
If you buy a good asset, right, a good property, even a B grade property, it doesn't have to be A grade, right? And you hold it long enough, you're going to make money. And holding it long enough, that's the secret, right? If you buy a good asset that is also suits your needs for the medium to long term, ideally, you're going to hold it long enough by virtue of the fact you bought an asset or a home that is going to suit you and you're going to enjoy living in it and you like the location and it works for you and your family, or if you're not in a family, whatever your circumstances are. If you focus on buying a good property that suits you, but also understood what makes a good asset in that area, and you put those things together, you're going to make a really good, sound decision. And you can weather out those peaks and troughs of the market. As I mentioned before, the data says that, in an aggregated data that is, that the market spends more time in upswing than it does in downturn. As long as you've got yourself something that is good for you and is a decent asset, you're going to be fine. And don't focus on making money. But we do, because it's a big, risky purchase, and it's expensive, and you're also taking on a 30-year debt and all the rest of it, then of course you want to sort of, our mental accounting makes us want to justify that by going, but it was also a good investment decision. And we do encourage our owner-occupier clients to think like investors in that regard. In that regard, like, you could find a home that's really comfortable, that fulfills your needs. But, if you got the choice between two of them, for example, one's on a better street than the other, or one's next to a petrol station and the other one's on a main road, or one's in a gully, one's on the high side of the street, or one potentially gets overland flow and the other one doesn't. I mean, there's often these sort of choices, and we don't often, but the reality is we don't often see two properties side by side simultaneously and get to choose to say, oh, look, I really would like to buy both of them. It doesn't really work that way. But the point being that if you err towards not buying a property with some faults that can't be fixed, then, that's sort of a big guide, I guess, that I always say to people, like, you're really just wanting to steer away from the stuff that can never be rectified. Because that's the stuff that when the market slows down is going to really cost you. That's the stuff that market slows down, and if you end up having to sell in a slow market, buyers will shun your property, And when the market's hot, they don't shun anything. But they do shun a lot of properties when the market slows down. So you don't want to buy one of those properties that other buyers will shun.
And just to underscore, I mean, I've been around long enough to know properties do go down. I lost money on a couple of properties in the UK when the markets crashed. But you still hang on and, hopefully get to the other side. I sometimes think that people almost get too worried about monitoring the weekly or monthly uptick in prices, right? And that's always a bit of a fool's errand, really, because I can point to you of areas in Sydney where prices are lower now than they were back in 2017. And I can point to other areas where prices are a lot higher than they were. So, it goes to show that where you buy is quite important, as well as what you buy. And that's something else that I think sometimes the mortgage brokers and buyers agents don't really help with in terms of thinking about a particular location. And there's an interesting article I saw the other day which made the point that, the classic argument was, well, you should think about things like communications and rail lines, because if you buy on a rail line, then you'll do better. It's interesting, there was a report that came out quite recently that said actually recently in Sydney, people buying in and around the rail lines didn't see as much growth as ones away from the rail lines, perhaps because people are working from home more than previously. And perhaps the types of property close to the rail lines were also not so well built and all those things. So some interesting observations there, that the intrinsic assumptions that some people have about where to buy and what to buy may actually not necessarily always be true too. So it comes back then to the particular property in the particular area and all of those things. So again, without wanting to sort of underscore this too much, it is complicated.
It is complicated. There's that adage, worst house, best street. Well, I've seen some streets where the worst house is just such a poor example of a property compared to everything else in the streets. The reason why it's the worst house, and it can't be fixed. That whole concept of worst house, best street sort of refers to unrenovated versions, something that you can actually bring up to the standard of the rest of the street. But the reality is that there are dogs in every suburb, and dogs in great suburbs, dogs in great streets, and people have to learn and understand that. And it does really get down to that micro granular level, as you mentioned earlier, and understanding how to sift out the good from the bad. And I do love it because we do work with those students from Home Buyer Academy, and we do work with them, and it's so interesting seeing how they come up from being really starry-eyed, I guess, about property, or really sometimes they're overly enthusiastic, and sometimes they're really overly critical, but sort of getting them to a point of equilibrium where they're like, okay, I get it now. I actually get I shouldn't go for that one because of da-da-da, and I will go for that one because of da-da-da. And I love that they can actually recognise that. This is a learnt skill that you can learn as long as you've got the right framework, and you're also out there looking at properties, and you keep a track of them, and you start to register which ones are worth going for and which ones aren't.
Now let's talk about compromise, right? Because there is no such thing as the perfect property, right? Even expensive property will have the odd things. And sometimes, again, in my conversations, I find that particularly first-time buyers say, well, this is not right because, or I can't go there because. So how do you tease out the things that are important to get right versus the compromises that you'll have to make?
It's a good question. And, Megan and I have actually done a couple of episodes on this and on the podcast because, we get exactly that. It's like, a lot of our students would do the course, for example, and they're right, I need to buy an A-grade asset and I'm not going to compromise on anything, and then they find that everything's got something wrong with it. So we call it perfectly imperfect or imperfectly perfect, right? And so there are absolute deal breakers, things that can't be fixed. We said earlier, like, if it's next to a petrol station, that can't be fixed. If it's next to a block of units and you can plant a run of bamboo, the clumping one, not the one that spikes everywhere. If you can block out a bit of an unsightly outlook, for example, and you can block it out, then you can fix that. If the floor plan can be rejigged to address it, poor room flow, and that's within your budget, you can fix that. Like there's a number of things that if it's got the facade of it originally was a weatherboard and someone's put faux brick all over it. It's really ugly now. You can fix that. My house, when I bought it, was like an ugly duckling, right? It's originally a Victorian house, but the whole veranda and everything been ripped off. It looked like it didn't have eyebrows. And, I fixed it. So there are things about some properties that are fixable. There are also things that aren't deal breakers, like, off the top of my head trying to think of some now, but like, I absolutely have to have, a home office and it has to be this size and blah, blah, blah. Like, and some first home buyers start off saying, well, look, I'm taking on so much debt. It has to be perfect. Otherwise I could possibly take on a 30-year debt. Well, it's not going to be perfect. So you do have to go through a process of working out what are the things that you cannot live without and what can you live without, and what's really important to get your knickers in and not over, and what isn't. And so, again, that is a process, because often when people first do the course and they come along to a campfire, a weekly campfire, and in the beginning of it, they're like, oh, I've been out there and it's all awful, it's terrible. And we'd start, show us what you've been looking at. Right. And I'll be like, I'm not so convinced that one's awful and this is why. And they go, oh, okay. And I encourage you to go out there and look at it differently, think differently about these things. And they'll go out there and they start to gradually get shape and get a bit more nuanced around how they look at property. And it's an important thing to do, because you do have to compromise. You do. But working out what is right for you is what part of the process, and also working on the deal breakers that you shouldn't compromise on ever. That's separate to that.
Yeah, and sometimes what I discuss when I have my one-to-one conversations is that, in fact, the two parties in the conversation, maybe husband and wife or whatever, they may have different areas where they're prepared to compromise. And so quite often I end up just sort of sitting on the sidelines while they have this sort of discussion between them as to, well, yes, the garden is important, but it doesn't have to be that big. Or, no, we need 4 bedrooms. Well, do we really need 4? It's fascinating how sometimes those conversations have not been had. and and it's really important to have a meeting of the minds, and as you say, to prioritize on the things that are really, really important. What are the nice to haves, and what are the things that are a bit of a bonus if you can get them? And that's a good way to think about it. So I sometimes say to people, make 3 lists, put in that first list, what are the things you must have? Make the second list, what are the things that would be nice to have? And then the third list, the bonuses. Focus on the first ones. And then, maybe a little bit of negotiation between the 3 columns to work out what exactly is the really critical stuff. And what I find quite often is that that framework can then help, because you then filter on where you look and what you actually think is really important. But again, the compromise conversation is one that I spend quite a lot of my time having. And sometimes I always feel a bit it's more like marriage guidance counselling.
I had a client once refer to me and our business as the threesome that's good for our marriage. So, because, we particularly in a buyer's agency, right, people do come to us, and quite often they've been looking for quite some time and not getting anywhere. And some people, I think of a Venn diagram, like you've got their, one partner's requirements around a circle, the other partner's requirements, and they start off and they sort of overlap more than they don't overlap. But then over time, the longer that they look, and often it's one partner is doing more looking than the other, those circles start pulling apart, and then the little bit in the middle becomes very little common ground. And, when it gets really bad, they might go and see a buyer's agent. And if the buyer's agent's got any skills, they will start teasing that out and understanding who's not being heard, who's not speaking up, and there's often a lot of passive aggression that goes on. And so we call our business in Good Deeds Property Buyers, we call it property therapy. That's actually what we do. And a lot of it is really around teasing out and making sure both parties have equal voice. In fact, we do a process at the beginning of every search called a getting started session. In fact, we teach it in Home Buyer Academy, the process of this, which is in our Where to Buy workshop. So Where to Buy workshop is part of the course. And so it starts off with, we call it the 3 Ps: price, property, and the position, location. So the property characteristics, so there were things in column 1, all the things that property has to have, right? And maybe some of the things in column 2 as well. And then there's the location, which is sometimes intrinsic in that, but often it's like, no, I only want to be in these suburbs, right? And then there's the budget. And sometimes the budget you're working with is actually your budget, that's all you can get. But sometimes it's also arbitrary. It's like, no, I don't want to spend more than that. Sometimes people do. They can and they should. Other times, that's fine. They should leave it as it is, right? But so you have to go through a process of looking at, well, what can you get for that budget that matches that criteria in the locations you want to be? Now, when you start looking at, and that's a process, as I said, in my business, we do this research for the clients. We sit down and take them on a guided tour. In Home Buyer Academy, in the First Home Buyer course, we teach you the process of how to do it. But it's a very, very important process, because it's all well and good to write your list of what you need, right? But if that doesn't exist, you are going to go and spin your wheels for a very long time. You may never buy. You may just get angry with the market because it doesn't give you what you want, and you may get nowhere. I mean, we had one client years ago in my business, the worst ever. They've been looking for 4 years, right? They did that exercise and bought in a month. And you go, you always had the capacity to buy, but you just didn't have the right framework. You didn't have, set up the reality check you need to make sure that all the things that must-haves, and maybe understanding some of the compromises that you might need to make and accepting them as well, and realizing that, okay, that's part of the process. If I insist on living in this location with that budget, these are the compromises I'm prepared to make in order to do so. So it's a very structured way of going about working that stuff out. But it's really important, because the sooner you do it, the less time you're going to, spend out there kissing frogs.
Yeah, and on that, of course, you had a very good time, I think, on the TV, right, on the location stuff, right? And what was interesting and fascinating to me was the way that people would sort of, say, I want to go there. And then you'd say, well, if you want to go there, then you're going to get this type of property or this type of property or this type of property. And you often then sort of saw them, well, hang on a moment, I want a bit of that, bit of that. But it's the right property in the wrong place or the wrong property in the right place.
Yeah.
Which gets me to ask the question about how important is location?
Oh, not as important as people say it is, to be quite frank.
Yeah.
Look, a lot of people go, oh, where should I buy an investment property, for example? It's like, that's a wrong question to ask. There's lots and lots of good locations out there. And the location for some people is paramount. Like all of their networks are in a location. It's close to where they work and where they do all their activities or whatever. They're just so established in an area, they will not move and could not move anywhere else without significant upheaval. So for them, if they're buying a home, location is so, so, so important, and everything else will take a back seat, right? But some people are completely location agnostic, right? And they're sort of a bit more dangerous because you go, oh, let's make sure we get you into a location that really is suiting you, right? And then there's also, I just saw that comment in the block, yeah. Oh, that was a total disaster. But, talk about a bunch of non-property people making decisions. But anyway, that's off topic. In terms of investment, look, location is important to the degree that you don't want to buy in a dud location, right? But there's lots of good locations. There's lots of good cities. There's lots of good regional areas that you could easily buy in, right? The problem with this fixation on location is everyone's thinking, well, where's the next hotspot? That's really what they mean when they say, where should I buy? Where's the next place to go off? Well, why are you investing in property? Did you understand that with every decade that you invest, your compounded returns are just get astronomical? Like if you understand that if you buy and you hold, that compounding is going to do the magic for you, not your location, right? And so this is focus on, obviously the location's got something to do in that, but it's this focus on location really is short-term thinking. And what I want to get people to understand is that if you buy something and you let it do its thing for 30 years, 40 years if you buy young enough, oh my God, you'll be blown away. It could be worth 14 times what you paid for it. Like the last decade, if you own it for 4 decades, it like doubles in value, I think. Doubles in value in every decade if it, does its job. But the reality, the most amount of money you make is in the year before you finally sell it, and compounding is something that is marvelous, but even my brain struggles with it at times, and I understand it, right? Our brains are not really designed to get long term. So we are default, we make bad decisions if we don't recognize this and override our base instincts.
Absolutely. And, time in market is as important as almost anything, right? And that's true.
As long as you've got a good asset, because time in market with a shit asset, you're just going backwards faster, right?
Exactly the same. Just like the stock market, if you have good stocks and you're in the market, you'll do well. But if you have bad stocks, they'll go backwards. So the quality of what you get is really important. Plus the time in market.
Value investing.
They are the two elements, right? It is rocket science, but it's not rocket science if you know what I mean. Now here's an interesting one. Any thoughts on property with subdivision potential? So, when you're looking at a property and it's got a large garden and you think, oh, well, now is that something you should factor in, and how do you factor that in? And where does that come in the decision-making process? Because there's a complexity here, isn't there?
Yeah, there is. And so look, here's the thing. If you are fortunate enough to know what you're doing and you can identify a property that has subdivision potential that nobody else has recognised and the vendor has not baked into the price, then great. But if it's already baked into the price and you're not necessarily a developer, or you're not thinking that you're going to make good on that potential, then don't make that part of your criteria.
Yeah.
You're
'Cause-
overcomplicating things, and a lot of people thinking, oh well, I have to get something that's got potential to add value or potential to subdivide or potential to do with this. That's what makes a good investment. Not necessarily, not because if you don't know what you're doing, you can make bad decisions. I've seen some pretty dumb developments done by people who do not understand their market, do not understand developing, do not understand building, do not understand anything, and have lost money because they've done what they read somewhere or saw a TikTok saying that this is how you make money, but they missed the bit that you actually need to know what you're doing in order to turn the subdivision into potential. So always be careful with thinking you've got to, that's the smartest thing to do.
And I'll make the point that if it has got development potential, almost always that'll be already priced in. And therefore, you will be competing with developers who potentially
Exactly.
have already done the work and worked out what the cost of developing would be, what the cost of building would be. And that means you could well be paying more than you think you are. So it's really important, again, to just be careful and not just assume, hey, it's a big spot, so of course, that's worth more
Yeah.
than a small spot. It may
Oh,
already be.
but I was speaking to somebody recently who bought a property thinking it had subdivision potential, and it was something like a metre short on the frontage.
Mm.
And then they found out that it wasn't big enough. And that was because they didn't get a survey.
Yeah.
So they bought it and based on the agent's plan, and they paced it out the front because their stride is a metre. Mine is actually a metre, but they paced it and they went, oh, it's big enough. Didn't get a survey, and then discovered it's actually a metre shorter than they thought it was. Unsubdividable. Stuck with it.
Yeah. And that underscores the other point. Understand the local planning regs, right? There are rules and regs about what can and what can't be subdivided, what can be built on and what can't be. And sometimes the high level plan that you get from the agent is not accurate enough to make that assessment. And a lot of people get caught on that as well. So that's worth understanding. Now, here's a little one. How many first-time buyers are rent investors currently? Is rent investing a good thing? What do you think?
Well, you would probably know how many first-home buyers are rent investors more than I would. Do you know how many?
Yeah,
What
about
proportion?
3 or 4%. It's not huge. It's not
Okay,
huge.
interesting. That's a good question because I hadn't thought of that. So rent vesting, actually, Megan and I did a little mini series on rent vesting in the podcast. Oh, when was it? Probably the very end of last year, I think, December, January. So rent vesting is good for some people, and I'm glad it's only 2 or 3% that are doing it because I think it's only good for a small percentage of first home buyers. And let me just sort of briefly touch on some of the risks of rent vesting. Rent vesting can trap some people into not being able to afford to buy their own home when they want to in the future. And a lot of people just think this accumulation strategy is what's going to get them where they want to be. But if you have to sell those properties in order to buy your home, then you're taking on more risk, or you're introducing more risk into the whole equation. There's market risk, there's also asset risk, there's also costs involved. Also, when you invest and you have to sell the property to buy your own home, you've got to pay tax on any capital gains that you make, or half of the capital gains as currently stands. So there's a lot of reasons to be wary about rent vesting. There are some people that it suits them really well. In some categories, for example, if they're in a position to buy, but they really have no plans to settle down, don't even really know where they want to live, right? And they're quite mobile or live overseas. So be careful with living overseas because you want to make sure you live back home at some point. But you need tax advice is what I'm saying there. So there are certain people, and if you know, for example, that you are in a career that you're going to have really good earnings down the track, and you are going to be able to hold that property and still be able to buy a home when you want to buy a home to live in, then so under those circumstances, rent vesting can really work very, very well. But a lot of people sort of fall into this trap of rent vesting because they can't afford their own home, or they can, but they sort of don't want to do the stepping stone strategy. And that is where you buy something sort of not ideal to start with, maybe something you can add value to, something that you can do something with to manufacture some gains, for example, so that then you can actually sell that and leapfrog up the property ladder. So there's a stepping stone strategy, if you like, and people don't want to do that necessarily, and they do rent vesting instead. But I've done strategy sessions and I've worked with people too often that have got trapped from rent vesting. So I really, give caution. I can give a couple of examples if you want some examples when I say people get trapped.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to know because I've had the similar experience talking with people, and some of the stuff they just never thought about.
No, look, I recently did a strategy session with this couple. It was actually heartbreaking. They've got two little kids, and they worked out that they couldn't really afford to buy a house, a family house or a home, townhouse perhaps, in the area where they were bringing up their little kids. And so the mum was talking to somebody in the schoolyard one day, and they just about the fact it's difficult. They'd saved this deposit, but they didn't really know what to do because they didn't have enough to buy a home, and they'd have to move right out of the area, and they didn't want to do that. And so this woman says to her, oh, you should talk to my person. Like we've got all these investment properties and we rent where we live, and well, we're doing really well. So lo and behold, they go and get introduced to this investment person who wasn't an investment person but a salesperson for a developer. And they bought 3 properties off the plan, 2 of which are settled and got tenants in them, and 1 of which is yet to settle. The one that is yet to settle, on my initial calculations, looks to be about 25% overpriced. The other 2 are in areas of massive oversupply, and I am confident neither of them are worth what they paid. Now they've come into inheritance, which if they added that to their savings, they would have easily been able to buy a home. And they are hamstrung because not only that, they've got to settle on this other one, which is massively overpriced. And all 3 locations have got fat development pipelines. They're still building, and they will continue to build. And so holding is not really an option because they're just going to continue going backwards. They have to take a painful decision and try to get out of them with the least amount of damage. And it's absolutely heartbreaking because they did it with all the right intentions, and they just didn't know enough about and neither of them are from Australia either originally. They weren't born here. The kids are, they're an Australian family now, but they've got overseas born parents. And so they're in this so now they've got this inheritance and they're no further ahead. They're actually behind where they would be if they just left that money in the bank. So that's one really heartbreaking. And another one was actually some clients of ours. I may have told this story before. I've told you when I've met with you but they're not the only story that I've come across like this, but it's just such a good story in the sense that they owned an apartment which was in an area of oversupply in Sydney, and they went and got some property advice from a company that did do a property plan for them and actually gave them good advice to say, well, look, that's a dog asset and you really should try to get out of it. And so they did. They sold it. They had minimal losses. I thought, well, maybe they made a small gain, but it's sort of they had to stop it because there was opportunity costs. They were not going to keep up with the market. Now, at that time, they could have afforded a small 3-bedroom home in a certain suburbs, a few suburbs on the sort of outer inner west, if you want to call that, in Sydney. And but they sort of looked at that and went, and they were sold on this idea because they had the property plan done but no, you can actually afford to buy 2 investment properties. You can buy houses in different cities and that's going to build your wealth. And then when that builds your wealth and equity, you're going to be able to go back, borrow money, and then you can buy your own home and you'll be able to get a better home. So that was sort of the dream that was sold to them. They bought 2 okay assets. They weren't amazing, but they weren't terrible, and in 2 different states, Queensland and South Australia. And thankfully for them, luck had it that those 2 markets had actually gone better than Sydney. And so because we do vendor advisory work as well, and so through our vendor advisory work, they had to sell the properties basically to afford to buy a home. And so they were about to get evicted. They had little kids. The landlord was selling the property. They were like, we don't want to rent anymore. and we can't afford to buy a home because we've got these 2 investment properties. So we did the whole evaluation process and worked out, okay, how are we going to go about doing this? And so our vendor advisory team, we helped get those 2 properties sold, and they both did quite well because they were in rising markets. So one of them was worse than one of them had some issues, but because the market was rising, they sort of all got smoothed over because of a rising market. So they ended up with 2 very good results. Brought that money back into Sydney, and you know what? We ended up buying them probably the last 3-bedroom home that they could have. It's like the limbo bar, and they got in just under. Managed to get them, I think, in the same sort of suburbs. They could have afforded the similar property way back before they bought these properties, so back in 2019. So it took them another 5 years basically of buying 2 properties. Then they had to sell those properties, they had to pay the tax on those properties, bring it all back, ended up in exactly the same position they were 5 years ago, 5 years earlier. It could have been completely the opposite. If they bought in areas that didn't boom quite as much as Brisbane, it was Brisbane and Adelaide. If they had bought in areas that didn't boom quite as much as those 2 cities had bought in, that had boomed, maybe they bought in Hobart and Melbourne, for example, like their situation would be completely different. So it's a good story. It just took them a lot longer to get to where they could have been if they just bought a home in the first place. And there was an inordinate risk in that. And so I'm glad that it didn't end up costing them, but it could have very easily cost them.
I think that's a really good object lesson, really. If you take the right turn or the left turn, you might get to the same destination, but it might take you a lot longer. You might well have incurred a lot of costs, additional costs along the way, transaction costs and all those things. And it might be a high-risk route rather than the low-risk route. So those are some of the things to think about. Yeah. Well, as we come towards the end of the show, Veronica, one last question for you. Homeland packages. I noticed that almost before the 1 October start, homeland packages went up between $50,000 and $100,000 because of the prospective increase in borrowing capacity and the increasing need to be able to effectively get people to come by. I'm really worried about the number of people who are stitching themselves up with these homeland package deals at the moment. What's your best advice in terms of how to think about that? And what are the key questions that people should ask themselves about homeland packages?
Part of the big issue with house land packages is there's lots of issues, but probably less issues than high-rise apartments, right? So it's like you go, oh, okay, I'm going to eat a shit sandwich. I get to choose my favourite bread, like white bread or brown bread. So the house and land packages bring a lot of risk with them. And the biggest risk, I would say, is in ongoing supply. So if you can find, and so all house and land packages aren't all bad. It's not like you're always going to lose money, but you have a high proportion or high probability of losing money. And why is that? Well, that is because if you're buying in a new subdivision that is next to lots of other new subdivisions that are going to come in the future, then why would a buyer in the future come and buy your property if you need to sell? So it's all right if you're living a stable life and you're never going to need to sell. But that not the way it works. So there's lots of risks around this, but this is one of them, is the resaleability, the saleability of your property. So first home buyers are incentivized to buy brand new, and so are investors, right? Investors do not get the same incentives if that house is 1 year old. Same house, they don't get it. It's not brand new anymore. They don't get to depreciate as much of the fixtures and fittings as they would if it was brand new. So an investor is going to go, I wouldn't buy that house. I'll go and buy the one in the next suburb, the new subdivision. I'm going to buy that off the plan, and I'm going to get all my tax benefits, right? The first home buyer says, oh, I'm not going to buy that house because I don't get a stamp duty concession on that, but I do get one on the new house in the next subdivision. So if you've ruled out first home buyers and investors, who are the 2 main buyer types for that type of property, then who's going to buy your property? And if no one's going to buy your property, what do you think is going to happen to the price? And so that is fundamentally the reason that values typically will go down before they go up in brand new properties. And you've got no control over how long it's going to take before they start to go up. You have to wait out all of that development time. And sometimes it can take 10 years. Like, it's a long time to wait before you actually see a return on your investment. If you've borrowed 95% of that, that means that for a long time, you're going to owe the bank more money than you would get if you sold it. And this is one of the reasons that banks would charge more interest on these loans, even though there's LMI, right? Lender's mortgage insurance that the government's paying for you, because it's riskier, right? The banks recognise the risks here, and buyers need to recognise that if the banks are pricing in risk, then you think, why are they doing that? Do I want to take that risk? And that's a clue, really.
Absolutely. And again, I've had one-on-one conversations with people who went through that process, bought a homeland package. It took a lot longer to actually get built than expected. It cost a little bit more. And of course, they paid top dollar because it included all the fixtures and fittings and all of the cookers and everything else, So it was lovely and shiny on day one. 2 years later, it was an ordinary house. Meanwhile, down the road, they were building other stuff. And it continues. And of course, the government's incentive to build at the moment means we're going to see more and more of homeland packages coming on market over the next 2 or 3 years. So this is a really important consideration for people. And again, we're not saying don't, but ask yourself really hard questions if you're going to go down that route. And of course, a lot of homeland packages are on the edge of cities, right?
Yes.
With very little in the way of infrastructure, relying on the car, relying on driving around and paying tolls and all of those things. And again, I quite often find that people didn't do the math when they actually thought about, what's it going to be like to live there? I need an extra car. What am I going to be doing in terms of getting around? Oh, that means I'm going to be paying tolls. And so the costs of actually living there are a lot higher than many people appear, which sort of takes me to my final point. When you actually think about whatever you're going to do with regard to, buying property, and particularly as a first-time buyer, make sure you do the math, not only of what can I afford versus what the price is, but also what is the ongoing story here in terms of what am I going to have to pay out? Insurance, electricity, gas, all of those things. What am I going to have to pay out in terms of maintenance of the property? All of those things too. Because quite often what I find, Veronica, is that people have got sort of swept up in all the PR, swept up in all of these highfalutin articles that we touched on at the beginning, on the government saying, we're here to support you, right? When they're not really. They're here to support maybe the seller or maybe investors, but maybe not first-time buyers. There's a really important question here about how you actually think about this from an ongoing financial position as well. And that's something I personally think is really, really important. A lot of people don't do that either. So for me, that's really critical.
Yeah, it's funny. Me and I did an episode on that too, the true costs of ownership. And it's funny because it was spurred off by something we saw on Facebook. Somebody commented on it was a rip-off that the council charges rates, And I'm like, oh, that's so funny. I mean, it's funny. I think it's actually sad. It's like, yeah, and you've got to maintain your home and you've got to do things. And when you're a renter, you don't have to worry about any of that stuff. Like, so people bang on about how terrible it is being renters. Well, sometimes actually there's a lot of good things in there as well. They've got that mobility, and I think that's, and this is another reason why, it's going to cost you, right? And you're going to be putting your hand in your pocket, and early years as well, until you get used to the mortgage, until you do see some capital growth, you're going to feel uncomfortable, with the repayments. And I often say this to investors, the first 10 years is the worst because it just feels like all it ever does is cost you and it never seems to make any money. But then after 10 years, you go, hang on a minute, where am I versus where I was 10 years ago? And if you bought a good asset, you'll start to draw some comfort. And the next 10 years, if you've done well, you could double in value again. And all of a sudden, it's like, oh, it doesn't feel so painful anymore. But it took 10 years to get to that point. And certainly for owner-occupiers, who've never actually been exposed to the costs of owning a property, it can be a rude shock, It's another reason why you need a good asset. You can be confident that if this is going to cost me, at least I know that, apart from having a roof over my head, apart from having somewhere lovely to live, that I chose this, it suits our needs, and I like the location, but I'm actually going to do okay financially long term. So it's doing a good job for me in that regard as well.
Absolutely. Well, as we come to the end of the show, I think what we're both saying is there is opportunity for first-time buyers at the moment with what the government has done, but there are also some important flags here and some important warnings. There are things you need to do if you're going to make the right decisions. And what we've tried to do this evening is to encapsulate some of the things you need to think about. I haven't covered them all, but I think we've covered the main ones. And Veronica, as we come to the end of the show, last advice to prospective first-time buyers, what would be the number one thing that they would do?
I think do our course, for God's sake.
Bit of cross-selling going on there. That's fine.
It's
recommended.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, look, I don't like to be all salesy, but the thing is that there is a process. You have to learn the process, and you have to learn along the way. And when you do learn the important things, and you do them in the right order, you can get where you want to be without taking all those unnecessary risks. So that's why I just say do the course. So homebuyeracademy.com.au. If I've got to go, I've done the plug, I might as well go all the way.
And I've put to Veronica's link there as well, so you can get to that from Veronica's website as well, because
Thank you.
it's all connected. Veronica, I want to say thank you so much this evening, and thank you for soldiering on with the throat. That was really good. Really, really important points that you've made as always, and your experience shines through. So thank you very much for that. I wish you a wonderful evening, and we'll have you back on, of course, probably in the new year, and see what the property market is doing then, because by then, of course, it'll be different again, won't it?
It will. Thank you so much, Martin. I always love chatting with you, and I hope the audience have got something out of it.
Well, I appreciate that. I'm going to take you offline, and I'm going to close the show.
All right.
Cheers.
See ya.
Well, there you go. I hope you found that informative and interesting, critical points there, and the links and things are below. Just to say that next week, Damien Klassen will be on, and we'll be talking about the markets. Of course, the markets are up and down all over the place, so that'll be fun. The dogs are here, I think. Well, sort of. Oh, they've moved. Looks as though they could never move, but there you go. They did have a move, so that they've been very quiet today, so the bins didn't disturb. And I want to say thank you for spending some time with us this evening. I hope you found that useful, informative. We'll look forward to seeing you next week on the live show. Meantime, of course, we put out our shows daily, and we cover finance and property and all related issues, and plenty to talk about at the moment. So thank you. See you later, and have a good evening. This is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics signing off. Bye-bye.